Okay.
Jane, I expect you to count each and every one in and out.
Oh, hang on. I'm getting all sorts of things. I don't want transcription. There we go. So I think that's everybody in from the waiting room, Edward. So and we're a couple of minutes past. So I think we're good to go. Oh, there's one more. I'll keep an eye on it and keep letting people in.
Okay. Right, let me just see if I can. Okay. I'm not sure my iPad was the thing to do this on. It seems to be being very temperamental or Apple-ish, but anyway, let's crack on and see how we get on. First of all, welcome to the first meeting of the cross-party group of the Scottish Parliament on rural policy for this year, 2022-23. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Edward Mount. I'm one of the co-conveners of the group along with Emma Harper. Now, as those of you will know, we've rearranged this meeting because we had to postpone the meeting that was originally planned for the 4th. But I'm pleased we've managed to rearrange it. And I think there were over 60 people signed up to come along. So that's a great group of people. Now, given the short notice, we've decided to keep this meeting online, but the following 3 meetings in this year will go into a hybrid format. So I'm hopeful that we'll welcome some of you into the Parliament, and those that you can't, I hope that you'll stay connected to us by the online method. I think all participants have had an agenda and the list of attendees. And you'll also know that this meeting forms part of our AGM. So we've got a bit of formal business to crack on with, and it's really important we get this right, because if we don't get this right, it goes in front of the Standards Committee in the Parliament, and I'm one of the members of the Standards Committee, and I'd hate to have to discipline myself. So we'll have to make sure we get that right when we come to it. Now, we've got a number of MSPs in attendance. Now, I can see Finley Carson. For some reason, I can't see everyone else. So, Jane, can you tell me if there's anyone else there?
Brian Whittle, I think, is there. I can't see him, but he's on the list there, so I assume he's in the meeting.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Brian and Finley, so I could be all right when it comes to the formal part of the meeting. I think Jenny Minto was hoping to come, so she maybe join us later. And I would just say that we have had a number of apologies from Rhoda Grant, Ariane Burgess, Katie Clark, and that will all be noted on the minutes, as will be those people who failed to attend the meeting. For those of you that have agile fingers and do 2 things at once, listening and doing, if you're tweeting about it, then could I ask you to use the tweet CPG rural, or one word, hashtag CPG rural. That would be helpful. And just a few practical bits of info. As I said at the beginning, please try and keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. And if you want to ask a question, you've really got 2 questions. You can raise your 2 options. You can either raise your hand or you can put something in the chat room, which for some reason, due to my iPad, I'm not being able to see, but I know I will be kept on track if I'm not seeing anyone. And if I really don't spot you and it's really annoying you, then just shout out and I will then have to pay attention to you. The unapproved minutes of this meeting will be prepared as soon as possible and uploaded to the CPG area of the Rural Policy Centre website. And the minutes obviously then being formally approved in the next meeting. And the Secretariat will ensure that any action points and links are noted and included in the minutes. So let's do the formal part first, which is firstly to approve the minutes of the last meeting, which took place on the 7th of June and focused on doing more with less. Now, I don't think the Secretariat have received any comments or queries on the minutes, so I'm assuming that everyone is agreeing with them wholeheartedly. Jane, tell me if anyone's hands are raised. Shake your head or no? Perfect.
No hands.
We're agreeing with that. And in terms of the action from that meeting, the Secretariat uploaded the recordings of the presentations to the web, along with the minute meetings, so you can have a look at those and watch again if you'd like. Now, this is the formal part of the meeting. As this is the first meeting of the year and forms our AGM, we're required to confirm our office bearers. Now, Jen, I think I can say that both Emma Harper, who is an SNP MSP, and myself from the Conservatives are down as co-conveners in the last session. And I will give way to you, Jane, if you want to find out if anyone strongly objects to us and wants to get rid of us. On the basis they may not, I'm happy to assume it back afterwards, Jane.
Sure, thanks, Edward. Yeah, so Edward and Emma are, which is great, keen to continue. Is there someone out there who would approve that? But Billy Carson, brilliant.
No, I'm just going to say I often strongly object to Edward and many of his forms, but in this instance, I'm happy to approve his reappointment.
Brilliant, thank you.
And are there any other MSPs there?
Yeah, me. I'm making tomato sauce. Yeah, I really object actually, Edward. Yeah, but I'll maybe hold it for another day.
Huh.
No, go ahead, Edward. Absolutely delighted for you to do that.
So Jenny, on that basis, that two of my colleagues who both grossly object to me, although we're in the same party, have agreed to allow me to stand again and Emma to stand again. I'll assume that that's acceptable.
Great.
And I would also just like to confirm that the SRUC's Rural Policy Centre are happy to continue as the Secretariat. So would somebody prepared to propose and second them? Just raise your hand. I'm happy to propose them. Would anyone be happy to second them?
Brian Whittle's waving.
Brian Whittle, perfect.
Yeah, I'll join in.
Thank you, Brian, for doing that. So that's the formal part. So the good news is I don't have to report myself for breaching any agreements to my own committee, which is great. We can move on to the interesting part now, which is the speakers for this evening. Now, we've got a couple of changes to the agenda that was planned on the 4th, because Jenny from Woodside Farm and Arran was unfortunately not available tonight, and Kerry Hammond from SAC Consulting, who was going to give some reflection on the presentations, was unwell, so has submitted her apologies. So we're going to have 3 short presentations on the keeping food local, and each of the speakers are going to have about 10 minutes. What I would say is I was really keen to do this for the simple reason that I think with all the things that we are facing in the world, whether it's the climate change and the problems of getting food, I think we need to encourage it to be produced as locally as possible. And we need to ensure that we buy local, supporting local producers. I mean, it's good for us to do that, and it stops us exporting our carbon footprint to other countries. And I have to say, I struggle sometimes when I see beans being flown from Kenya and people buying those opposed to local produce, which to me always tastes better, especially when it's in season. So that's me giving my plug of why I think this is really important. What we'll do is we'll go through all the presentations. We'll do one after the other, and then we'll take questions. So I'm going to introduce each speaker as they're about to speak. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Professor David Marshall from the University of Edinburgh Business School, who will discuss his recent research on informal food networks in the Western Isles, which I think was done with his colleagues in Stirling University. David, I'm intrigued to know what you found out and look forward to hearing what you got to tell us. You've done what everyone
David,
tries to do to me, David, as a politician, mute him, yeah. But you did it yourself. So okay. That was the first mistake. David, over to you.
Thank you, Edward. It can only get better. Jim, would you like me to share my screen? Yeah, okay.
Go for it, David. Great, thank you.
Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, thanks everyone for turning up this evening for this sort of reconvened meeting. My name is David Marshall from the University of Edinburgh, and as Edward said, along with my colleagues Paul Freighey, Kerry Davis, and Eric Calderwood from the University of Stirling, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of us all for this opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing at this cross-party group on rural policy. What we're doing tonight is in a way tangential or related to the topic of keeping food local. But at the universities of Edinburgh and Stirling, we have over a number of years been looking at issues around patterns of consumption, purchase behaviour, and thinking about retail provision, particularly in relation to food and retail provision amongst remote and rural communities. Amongst other things, we've looked at issues around retailing and the retail infrastructure. We've been looking at some of the ways in which rural residents try to access food, for example, using online local stores or out shopping. And as part of that, also trying to think a little bit about the ways in which remote communities in particular are fairly resilient and adaptive in the faces of what are often very, very significant challenges. So what I want to share tonight is based on a little bit of work which we've been doing, which is a series of workshops funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've been looking at based on a couple of short visits out to the Western Isles, talking to some folks out there, and also based on the first of a series of workshops. And we've been looking really at the informal food economy or the informal food network in relation to food access. And I hope that over the next few minutes, we can share some of that and also reflect a little bit on some of the issues in relation to local food. So I want to start really with I guess, probably what you may think of in terms of at least the specific location of the Western Isles, home production, sales and crofting. And I think one of the things that struck us was that whilst the ownership of crofts remains widespread in the Western Isles, in fact, in talking to folks and on our visits, one of the things that we sort of picked up on was that, I guess, perhaps not surprising to a number of you, in many cases, people are having to work in other jobs, other forms of employment to simply maintain and make everything work. In terms of food access and food provision, there is evidence of the crofts producing food for themselves, but the challenges of the season, the conditions of the soil and the land mean that actually the amount of food that's available to be sold or bartered or shared or gifted, even in gluts, is in the scheme of things relatively small. Now, we did find lots of examples of, for example, people selling eggs and milk. We did hear stories of sheep going off to the mainland to be fattened, of people picking up fish from the quayside, or finding other ways to sustain or maintain the crofting income. But I think we also had a sense that a number of those crofting skills were actually being lost or not passed on, particularly in terms of, for example, cultivation or slaughtering and butchering skills. We did find evidence, of course, of local markets. There are a number of local markets. These tend, for the most part, to be fairly seasonal, often with restricted trading hours. But there is evidence of local produce and fresh local produce in those markets. We also found examples of home delivery and box schemes where local producers were actually getting products out to the island residents. And interestingly, actually, social media played quite an important role in terms of sharing some of that information. However, we did hear some comments that in certain cases, the markets were often geared up to tourists as much as they were to cater for the needs of locals. Of course, community co-ops and social enterprises are extremely important. And in fact, certainly in our earlier work, we had a sense that they often were important alternatives to the sort of standard retail, national retailers. Again, in many cases, They were flexible in terms of their price, their stocking policies, and whilst they did have a range of local produce, they still were heavily reliant on mainland supply and distribution networks. Now, I'm not going to say anything about social community enterprises because Sarah's going to talk about that a little bit later. Suffice to say, we had the pleasure of visiting Sarah back in May, and I think Bùth is a great example of where there is local produce, and you can see that in these pictures that we took in the store back in May. All local produce clearly labelled, but I'm sure Sarah will say something more about that in a few moments. We also looked at community gardens because we were interested in community gardens as a source of local fruit and vegetables. And I think one of the things to say is that the community gardens that we visited are doing an absolutely amazing job, but focus primarily on this issue of well-being and well-being through growing and producing plants and vegetables. But certainly when we were there in May, there was a somewhat limited selection of fruits and vegetables. And I think it raises interesting questions about the ability or the capability of, for example, community gardens to scale up to meet any form of volume demand, certainly without the investment of something like polycrops, which again are becoming increasingly popular on the islands. I think also we need to acknowledge the reality for many residents in terms of the provision of food banks. Food banks, like the community gardens, are often focused on and addressing issues around well-being, particularly in terms of food poverty. And in this illustration, we can see food that's been donated by a local retailer. Some of that is going in to make produce, to make products in the cafe. The rest of it is available for those who need to access it. And we were also struck by some of the ways in which people could access food from the food banks. What was important was the need for discretion and respect, particularly in the island communities. Of course, we can't talk about food access without thinking about local grocery retail. And again, those of you who know the Isles will know that there's a wide range and diversity of local grocery retail outlets, from independent retailers through to food trucks. Most of these were independent, but again, in many cases, supply was heavily dependent on existing distribution networks. But again, in this example, we can see illustrations of local produce available in the local supermarket. And of course, that takes us then on to the national grocery retailers. In the Western Isles, both Tesco and the Co-op have large supermarkets up in Stornoway, but the Co-op has a number of stores across the islands. And in our discussions, I think it's fair to say that there was general support for the national grocery retailers, both in terms of the range, the availability, and the quality of the produce that they brought to the islands. Although, again, we heard very different views on price. For some, they were price competitive. In other cases, they were seen to be very expensive. Another interesting innovation has been the availability of online delivery. But again, in terms of the stories that we were told or we recounted, in many cases, you may have to wait some time to book your delivery slot, certainly if you're out with the urban area. So again, some interesting opportunities, but raising questions around food access and challenges. So what do we take from this sort of quick visual whirlwind through the Western Isles? Well, I think a number of things just to pull out, perhaps by way of discussion. It's clear that the island residents are still heavily reliant upon national grocery multiples. And I think one of the things is that creates a degree of vulnerability, certainly to externalities. Need I say ferries, weather, cost of living, fuel? They're all real problems facing those living in remote communities. Again, we find reasonably good retail food provision in terms of what's already there, certainly better and an improvement on what we saw 10 years ago. But the availability of local is highly variable within the conventional market. I think interestingly, in terms of the informal food networks, we find fairly limited evidence of informal provision in terms of growing and producing food or gifting food, certainly in terms of established networks. And to borrow on McKentry's idea, a decline in what she called traditional localism. But I think on a positive note, there are lots of examples of good local informal food networks. But I think in the scheme of things and looking in the round, these are very much complementary and an integral part of the food access network that exists there at present. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks for listening. And I hope that we can open up some discussion and debate. And we look forward to some questions at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, David. I think I'd add on those list of things that we might want to discuss at the end is relying on seasonality of produce. I think that's an important issue. I think the whole issue of crofting and smallholder legislation, do we need to see a revival of that? And is there a role in that? And also, I think, gosh, we've got to talk about national grocers buying locally, shipping it off and then bringing it back to sell it locally. There are so many examples of carrots going hundreds of miles to come back into the local supermarket. I think there's great things that you've mentioned as well, David. So we're going to go to Denise Walton from Peelham Farm in Berwickshire, who's going to explain how they are coordinating with other organic farmers and retailers to develop routes into market. So Denise, over to you.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much, Edward, and thank you very much for having me on this group. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you about what we've done as farmers over the last 30 years to supply locally. When Chris and I first started farming 30 years ago, we were actually smallholders. So we were smallholders on 20 acres and started by literally selling, using a local butcher to cut down pigs to sell to family and friends. And by the time, quite by chance, we got the opportunity to farm more land, farmers' markets had appeared, if you like, and were becoming established. That was about 1999. And it was really farmers' markets gave us a much greater opportunity to sell locally. And then within about 5 or so years of farmers' markets, chefs started, if you like, locking on to local products. And so our initial sales locally were to chefs and restaurants. It's only really within the last 5 to 10 years that independent retailers have become a very important part of our business, in addition, thanks, Michelle, in addition to online. So just a very quick resume of what we do, so it gives you a feel of how we're using the farm to produce locally. 650 acres, we're mixed organic and pasture for life. These certifications and audited processes really give us traction in a very competitive marketplace. And this is important when it comes to supplying locally. A family farm, we farm cattle, sheep and pigs. We built our own farm butchery, which you can see in the image to the right-hand side. First of all, in 2008, we expanded it last year to basically triple the capacity of the butchery to hang carcasses and to process and produce. The farm is holistically managed. It's a very important part, if you like, of our approach to our market, that A, we're local, B, we manage not on a profit per hectare basis, but on a profit per farm basis. And also ecosystem enriching. Again, these are important, if you like, features of selling locally, because effectively what we're doing, selling locally from a locality, is part of our story, is what we do for the locality. Next slide, please, Michelle. So here we go. We're adding value on farm to about 1.8 tons of meat, all of which comes from the farm. So we have about 60 product lines of our standard cuts, and we're adding value to about 75 products. So what we've learned since we started selling pork joints in 1990, when we were smallholders, is diversifying our product base. Initially, there was a lot of waste. So I sought as many ways as possible to add value to waste. And again, this in terms of providing for a local market, it's actually gaining critical mass of products, a critical mass of different product lines and diversity. Next slide, please, Michelle. So we have about 11 full-time equivalents employed, all from the local community. We've taught skills on farm. We've taken butchers to Italy to learn how to, if you like, the craft of making charcuterie in order to supply a growing local market. So we're very lucky, though we're a relatively remote farm, that we've managed to hold on to a core team of individuals who actually really want to, are very much in line of our ethos of producing locally and selling locally. And they help also with farmers markets as well. Next slide, please. So supplying direct with provenance and traceability. We do a lot of customer facing at farmers markets. We have on-farm open days where we have long table lunches to people mostly from the locality, from the borders as well. And this is all part of selling our product because, you know, we're not, if you like, we're not a standardized product. We're a very diversified product, and we're selling to our diversified marketplace. And selling locally is about having the opportunity to localize and individualize our products to small groups of people and to individuals. So provenance and traceability are all about the local brand and strengthening local production. Next slide, please. So our routes to market and greater access. So value in diversity of outlets. About 60% of our products are wholesale, and about 10% of which go to restaurants and hotels in Glasgow and Edinburgh. About 90% of our wholesale goes to independent retailers, which, as I mentioned earlier, has really increased in the last 10 years and absolutely took off during COVID. The local independent retailers supplying locally really, they kind of found their place during COVID. And what we've also discovered is that we've managed to hang on to about 20% of our pre-COVID customer base, and the independent retailers have also. So the independent retailers are not just shops, they're also box schemes and also local dairy runs. We supply a local dairy run in Edinburgh who the delivery of milk bottles is becoming more popular, and we're supplying those. So I suppose we're small enough to be flexible enough to diversify our outlets. 40% is retail, and of course that's even more local. Farmers markets in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Kelso, that's about 50%. 50% of our retail is online, and that's growing between 12 and 15% year on year. Most of our online is Scottish, and then that's our priority. Most of our customers are Scottish based, and then secondly, the rest of our stuff goes down to London within the M25. We're also working with the Cyrenians, and this is a donation scheme, and this is a sort of diversity of outlets, in that in terms of sort of gifting our produce, what we do, we invite customers onto our website to donate to the Cyrenians as part of their purchase. And we have dedicated Cyrenian products from which we basically we give a 15% discount. So we're giving, if you're taking off 15% of the value of the product to individuals who are prepared to donate. We also give to Sardians and local food banks as well. And this is about improving local access to what we're doing. And it's a really, really important part of what we do. So local isn't just to a buying market, it's also to everybody, and it's allowing access to good local food, particularly to the most vulnerable. You know, we live in the hope that our vulnerable communities will one day be less vulnerable and will one day be purchasers of our products. Everybody is a customer, and so we treat everybody equally as customers, whatever their sort of income background or their levels of vulnerability. And interestingly, our retail goes out to a wide demographic and to a wide range of individuals of different income backgrounds. Next slide, please, Michelle. So when it comes to collaboration, collaboration is actually extremely important. So our approach, my approach, is that you share the market to grow the market. There's no such thing as competition. It's all about collaboration. And good collaborators actually are probably the best competitors. You can compete best in collaboration. And it's very much in our interests as local farmers and producers to grow the market that we're in. And also our ethos is about sustainable land use. And we grow the market to increase the area of sustainably used land. And we grow the market to increase access to our products. So we work very closely with other like-minded farmers, and in particular about 5 other organic and pasture-of-life farmers to supply consistency of ethos and quality. And while that has, you know, many benefits, when it comes to our brand and their brand, ethos and quality is about brand consistency, and that is very important. So what we've got 650 acres produce the number of animals to go through our butchery. So we work with other suppliers of pork, lamb and beef when we are seasonally low, so that we can call on them to, if you like, increase capacity through our butchery. And it's about sort of critical mass. So we work with them and they work with us. We have a reciprocal arrangement. In the image on the bottom right, that's Sasha Grayson from Grayson Organics. Though Sasha isn't directly involved in the selling of organic meat from the farm, we set up a very early collaboration and actually went down to Bharraigh Market. We set up the Saltire Organic Meat Company, which really to supply food for life, but we were probably ahead of the game in that the market wasn't ready for the level of collaboration. But that's a very good example of an early collaborative process, and we still do work closely with the Graysons at New Milne. Next slide, please. So challenges in the future. If we want to keep, it's not just about keeping food local, because we could do with a lot more local food. It's about growing local food. And the biggest challenge is localized infrastructure. And if we want a local food economy, which everybody does want, and we've got the Good Food Nation Act, we have absolutely 100% got to improve local infrastructure. Abattoirs, bottling plants, dehusking plants. We simply cannot talk about localizing food or keeping food local, growing food local, unless we're also going to talk about support, policy and funding support for localized infrastructure. That is critical. The other challenge, of course, is competition. The multiple retailers have done and will continue to set the pace on price. So we do our very best to keep prices as level as possible, but it is difficult. So that is an ongoing competitive issue, which is why we really have to work extremely hard at our unique selling point, which is our localized brand, which is about selling the locality to the locals and to a wider market. Distribution, logistics and costs, as you can imagine, going through the roof at the moment based on the price of fuel. We ship both chilled and ambient. All our charcuterie is ambient. Selling chilled, we sell fresh chilled. We use a local distribution network in insulated boxes, but distribution, logistics and costs are a very, very big challenge to local food distribution. Skilled labour, we're very lucky at the moment. There's a shortage right along the whole food chain. So keeping or growing a local food economy depends on a local pool of skilled labour to work on farms and to add value to farm products and to work in the specialist atmosphere and environment of food processing and adding value. Supply chains, absolutely. There are a lot of willing individuals and producers and farmers who want to grow the market through collaboration, but are held back by the issues of localized infrastructure, distribution and skilled labour. We can definitely grow the local market based on the growing traction that independent outlets are having in the food market. There is really an exponential increase in ethical independent retailers, both in Scotland, the north of England and the rest of the UK, who are really looking for the kind of product that us and other local food producers, local farmers who are selling direct are producing. Market differentiation is, again, another important issue in that local branding can automatically provide a really unique sort of selling feature with benefits to health, welfare and environment. So, as Edward mentioned earlier on, the carbon footprint, the fuel miles of shipping product from abroad to the UK or vice versa is crazy. We can do it ourselves. You know, we're living in a temperate climate. We're living in an environment that is very forgiving as an environment. We've got forgiving soils, we've got forgiving climate. We should be producing locally for local communities. It's easy for us. And we need to make it easier. So market differentiation is important for local branding. Next slide, please. So there you go, from our farm, through our butchery, to adding value, to selling direct. And that's what we've been doing and growing on for the last 30 years. And I'm very optimistic that we can grow the local market, we can grow local food outlets, but we absolutely have got to look at local infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Nearly made the mistake of keeping myself muted. I see that somebody in the chat room was suggesting that I volunteered myself for a table tasting of dry aged mutton, which appears to reach somebody's heart in there. So I think I don't know, Denise, you couldn't probably see all the comments that were coming up in the background, but you seem to be not only hitting the right notes with the food, but also with the issues that are being faced by keeping food local. So I'm sure we shall have some questions on that. And I'm going to go next to Sarah MacLean, who I am not going to try my pronunciation. Sarah tried to educate me before. It was a slow process and I didn't learn quick enough. So I'm going to say from the Bharraigh shop, which is a community and social enterprise providing a route to market for local produce and opportunities for local people. And if I can just say, Sarah, I saw some pictures of your food earlier. Try and remember, us MSPs didn't get a break from coming to the chamber to you this evening. So we're all starving. So try not to tempt us with too much local product. But over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me along today. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, looks good, Sarah. Yep.
Okay, so yeah, my name is Sarah MacLean. I'm the founder and manager of Bùth in Castleby, Isle of Barra. My husband and I, we also have a croft, and he is a creel fisherman. And the majority of his catch goes direct to France and Spain. Barra is in the Outer Hebrides, 90 miles from Oban as the crow flies. The ferry is 4 3/4 hours from Oban, flight an hour from Glasgow. Population 1,100, and we get around 17,000 visitors a year. So Bùth is a social enterprise which acts as a route to market for local products and provides other goods and services to the community and to visitors on the island. But it all started as a local market in 2000. When Bharraigh and Bharraigh Agricultural and Horticultural Association was set up. Its main function was to run monthly markets to give people access to local products, and they were throughout the year. But as the markets became more and more popular, we asked the community what would entice them to buy more local food, and the answer was easy access. So if it was in like a shop, and at the same time we also had major complaints on the island that from the visitors that there were no local gifts that they could buy. So the shop would help with both of these things. So we started in 2012, and I think if we rushed into doing a shop in Castleby, which is the main settlement on Bharraigh, then it could have failed. So we started with a summer cafe up at Northby, and this allowed the producers to get into the way of providing goods on a more regular basis rather than just for once a month shop. It was a great success. It made money to pay some staff and the hall. So then we planned our Christmas shop, which ran for 3 weeks and raised £10,000. From January, there was quite a lot of momentum for the project going, so we kept it going. And in October 2013, Bùth was formed. Opened in its current location, which is the old co-op in Castleby, in December 2013. So our main aim is always to provide a route to market for local producers and opportunities for local people to help the families here become more sustainable on the island, and also build partnerships with other groups like the Community Garden in Northby and boost the local economy. So from our 2019 figures, for every £1 spent in the shop using the local multiplier effect, it generates £2.58 for our local economy. So how does it all work? All local producers are welcome, and we take a percentage of their sales. They set out their own price, including our percentage. It's done on a sale or return basis. We help them with their product presentation, their labelling. We have a really good relationship with the environmental health, who are very helpful. We may take off-island producers to sort of fill in gaps, and we certainly support other islands like South Uist venison, Uist meat, charcuterie from Lewis, Tiree tea, for example. All the stock is on an EPOS system, and each producer has their own number. All their stock's entered onto the system, and every month, at the end of every month, they get paid and they receive all their sales spreadsheets. You'll notice the wee flag on the slide, and that's the Bharraigh flag. So products that are actually made by people that live all year round on the island, they get a little flag on their labels so that it's easy for people to identify what has actually come from Bharraigh and Bharraigh. Of course, we could not survive just on local produce alone and the commission from local produce. So we do have other goods and services that fills the gaps locally, but also helps provide us with an income to pay staff, to pay all the bills, for example. We bring in, we have like our refillery, we have quite a lot of whole foods, which allows our community to have a different, what am I trying to say, different diets. It helps different diets that people are having. So we also do the visitor information on the island, and we have a laundry, and all these things, they're all things that our community needs, and we are able in a position to provide that. We also provide work placements, volunteering opportunities, and work experience. We're a living wage employer. We employ 4 full-time staff and 12 volunteers. We don't have any external funding for our core costs. So for the future, there's just some details. For the future, we are about to buy the building that we are in, and we will be renovating that. But something we've always had on our business plan is also to have some shared processing facilities where local producers can process their products without environmental health having to come around their kitchen, or just providing more space for them. So that is something that is also we're wanting to do in the near future. Okay, thank you.
Now, Sarah, you deliberately tempted me throughout that with beautiful food offerings, which I'm struggling to. And it appears you brought a fairly large fan club who've all been to your shop and are saying what an excellent place it is. So well done for you on that. And yeah, well, there's a whole lot of comments. You can read them in slow time and enjoy them. And just while everyone gets their questions ready, I'd like to just pose a question, if I may, and I'm going to ask each of the speakers to answer it in turn. So any questions you've got, either raise your hand, and sorry, it's very off-putting. It's saying, Sarah, you should be in every community in Scotland. So there you go. But I'm going to ask you to, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. And if you don't want to ask it yourself, put it in the chat room. So the first question I want to ask, and I'll go to David first because he's had a long rest, and then I'll go to Denise and then Sarah, if I may. Do you think the lack of local facilities, such as abattoirs, bottling plants, processing plants, are holding local food provision back? And how do we correct that? There you go, David, off to you. Easy question to start with.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my Sterling colleagues are welcome to come in if they want. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very good point. And again, when we were on our visit in May, it was one of the issues that came up. Someone in the chat mentioned the cost of having to transport particularly sheep over to the mainland to get slaughtered and then come back. I think there was a history in parts of the Western Isles of some abattoirs existing and then going out of business. So I think it's one issue is the challenge of growing and producing food, local food, but the other issue then is very much about the processing facilities, and that was one matter that most certainly came up in our discussions, the need for either abattoirs or, as I mentioned at the start, some of those skills. For example, home slaughter. We spoke to some people where they used to use home slaughter. So again, it's tied in, I think, with provision and availability. There are also issues about changing legislation, etc. So yeah, I would definitely confer with Denise and some of the comments that the processing facilities are one in a number of factors that have an impact on the availability of local produce.
Dan, perfect. Going to go to Denise next. Could I ask, could we delete the shared screen, as it were, so I can see all of you? And I would ask if you could put it in the chat room, because my iPad is being very Apple-ish and I can't see all your hands, and I don't want to miss anyone. So Denise, if you could answer that briefly, and then to you, Sarah.
So just to repeat the question, do we need basically local infrastructure to...
Yeah, well, my question do you think the lack of local infrastructure is holding things back, and how do we correct that?
Yeah, absolutely, it's holding things back. You know, it's you know, one of the questions that has come in the chat is, do we slaughter locally? Well, actually, no, we don't. But we have to take our animals down to County Durham to be slaughtered. And we're equidistant between the abattoir in Durham and the abattoir at Shotts. So we could use a Scottish abattoir, but they kill animals on different days. We'd have to transport them several times a week, and we couldn't afford that. So we share a lorry with another local producer, as it happens, an RSPCA Freedom license lorry to take our animals down to Durham. So yeah, and it's very expensive and it's very tenuous, and the abattoir, I think, just suffer us. They don't, you know, they're putting big numbers through. We're what's called a private kill, and we have to really behave ourselves. I can't ask the abattoir too much, or he'll stop slaughtering our animals. So yeah, it's not that it's holding back, because really the issue is there never really has been a local food economy. But if we want to grow the local food economy, then we have to have the local infrastructure, because it just is not going to happen. You know, we're losing abattoirs all the time. It's having a huge impact, not just on the local food economy, but on our farming industry. And how do we make it happen? Well, there's got to be much stronger policy and policy support. There is already pretty good policy support. We need much stronger policy support, and we need funding. One of the issues, incidentally, about abattoirs are very difficult to make money from, not least because of the burden of, if you like, food standards and environmental health regulations that have to, and the need for vets. And, you know, unfortunately, one of the issues was the majority of vets that were, one of the reasons we're losing abattoirs is because the majority of vets who are used in abattoirs were European, and they've all gone home. So abattoirs have lost something like 90% of their vets. So there's quite a lot to improve and look at abattoirs. I mean, there have been a number of initiatives to try and get local abattoirs going, but without public funding, it's difficult to make abattoirs work. In the past, abattoirs used to be a public service. Local councils had their own abattoirs that they funded. So we need to have a different mindset when it comes to local food infrastructure. And it goes for all the other local food infrastructure. It's not just about abattoirs.
Okay, I think that's really interesting. I'm going to come to you, Sarah. There are lots of comments. Denise, you want to read in the thing about local abattoirs? I think we all want to read. I mean, I've certainly, since I've been in this parliament, we've talked about mobile abattoirs and trying to get them out to crofts and to locations like Skye, so that animals can be killed and sold locally. So I think there's really, really interesting. I don't know if you can see it, Denise, or if it's possible, there's a few in there that you might be able to reply to, which we'd love to see your replies on. So Sarah, and then I'm going to come to Finn, and then I've got Angus Y, and then I've got Fiona Morrison. So Sarah, if you could answer that briefly.
Yeah, just quickly, crofts are really small, and the amount of produce that's produced is small, and the best way to make the most money out of it is to value add onto what they produce. I have to say that the environmental health officers in the Western Isles are brilliant, and they've checked so many kitchens in Bharraigh and Battersea, so people can do that from home. but it does put some people off, and you might not have the space you need at home. And I think if we can have like a shared local processing facilities and shared equipment, that would make a big difference. We already have some shared, we have a honey spinner and a honey press that we lend out, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that could be done.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to go to Finn. There's a comment there that no one's done anything since the 1990s with local abattoirs. Gosh, we failed. We need to do something. Finn, with your question.
Just on local abattoirs, there was a group of local farmers tried to open a new abattoir in Bùth, but they just couldn't get the critical mass to make the sums add up, which is quite incredible given the number of small scale producers that they could potentially have accessed that. So critical mass, the number of you touched on critical mass, and that's obviously of critical importance. But my question was, in light of what I thought was a very disappointing outcome to the Good Food Nation bill, and the potential that local and national plans are not going to be developed or even consulted on until the end of 2023 and into 2024, what needs to be done in the short term regarding cutting some or making it easier for small producers to get through the minefield of environmental health regulations, labelling, trading standards and whatever? What support is currently out there, and is there something we can do to make it easier for small scale producers to get their products to market?
Sarah, do you want to go with that, followed by Denise?
Yeah, and certainly our local environmental health are really, really approachable, and they help with all the labelling, things like that. We ourselves, because we've been doing this for quite a while now, we have quite a good knowledge of how things should be labelled and stuff like that. But I would say before we do anything, speak to environmental health.
Okay, Denise, do you want to come in on that?
Philly, you wouldn't mind repeating the question, please? I'm sorry, I was reading the chat.
My question is, I'm probably asking the question because of the experience that some of my constituents in Galloway have had with regards to trying to get their products on shop shelves, and lack of support and encouragement from the local environmental health office, which would appear in some cases to put up barriers rather than provide encouragement. So my question is around, is there anything we can do to improve how environmental health or trading standards or local funding bodies can help little producers get product to market?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because environmental health officers in different regions have different approaches. Ours have always been very supportive. And even when we started doing charcuterie and salamis in sort of 2002, where they were very wary of it, and rightly so, until I pointed out the Italians have been doing it for thousands of years. But nonetheless, they actually they have been really supportive. So it would help a lot if environmental health attitudes regionally were, if you like, standardise is perhaps the wrong request, but how is it that environmental health officers in different regions can have different approaches to local food producers? So that definitely needs to be sorted out, and that needs to be in line with trading standards. So the standards need to be standardised, and the approach to local food producers needs to be standardised. And in fact, it would be really good if perhaps there were sort of local food officers and local authorities who could advise, Sarah describes, advise on labelling, and even have a labelling hub, and have hubs for producers that were based with the local authority.
Hedro, can I just ask, on the back of that, Denise, you're obviously from the South of Scotland region. Should South of Scotland Enterprise Agency do more to sort of facilitate the coming together of all these different bodies to help support small producers?
Well, I think they do have, I'm sure, they do have a food officer, who's actually been who has been here, but I mean they've got quite a large area. So yeah, I think that it's definitely on their agenda. And I'm sure that we will see more in the future.
I'm going to move to David briefly, if I may. I mean, this chat box is alive. It's sort of squirming. I can hardly keep up with it. So I apologise if I'm not calling anyone in, but I'm sure we're all watching it, and I'm mega impressed that Denise is answering a question online at the same time as she's answering a question on Zoom. David, do you want to add briefly, and then I promise I'm coming to you, Angus.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to comment on the last question, just because that's not really my area of expertise. But so would you like me to comment on the note from Vanessa, which is in there? Is that, or did you want me to say something specifically about
you must be a politician answering the question that you want to answer. Answer the question you want to answer quickly, and then we'll go to Angus.
Yeah, I mean, I think in relation to Vanessa's question, I mean, it's interesting if you look at some very successful producers, for example, I can think of one in Uist. I mean, that business survives because of their ability to sell into markets off the island. So I think that's another thing, is that producers often do need to have some form of support if they're reliant primarily on that local market. I mean, it's interesting that Sarah mentioned that 17,000 visitors into Bharraigh a year. I mean, that's a big temporary market, but it also probably comes with very different demands to those who are living in the 1,100 who are living in Bharraigh all the time. So I think thinking about the nature of that support and what it means for local producers is extremely important. It may be about actually helping them to access markets, not only locally and support local markets, but to go beyond. And I think it's often a challenge with small local producers in terms of trying to find markets beyond the markets that exist locally.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to Angus. Sorry, I've kept you waiting. The floor is yours.
That's quite all right, no problem. So I've got two interconnected questions. They're originally for Sarah, but I think Denise will have some comments on them as well. So it was two questions. Really impressive, the journey you've been through with the community shop. What were your biggest challenges in setting up and expanding? So maybe if there was just one thing that was a real obstacle for you to get over that then allowed you to pick up pace, and then connected to that, what was the one thing? It sounds like environmental health might be the answer to this question, but what were if there was a one thing that would have made all the difference and you wouldn't have had success unless that had been in place? So really the enabling factors of how you managed to make such a successful journey.
Okay, I think our biggest challenge has been our building. Fiona will know all the challenges we've faced, but after a community asset transfer, we were turned down twice, but we've appealed and we finally won. So that is a massive weight moving forward. So buildings are so important in these small areas because there's not many of them, but a building is such an opportunity to do all sorts of things with. And I think perhaps local authorities maybe need to realise that more and help community groups access them easier. We've had all sorts of help through the way. We got some funding from First Port, which really came at the right time, and that just helped us lift on and develop a little faster. It wasn't a lot of funding, but it was enough. It was just what we needed to move on. And we've had so much help and support from our local community and far beyond, and that has really helped. The momentum of the project has just kept going. So, yeah.
Angus, is that you?
Yeah. That's great, thanks. Yeah, and maybe Denise, is there something similar? Was there one thing that's really helped your journey that, looking back, you think was a turning point?
Well, access to an abattoir. So we used Whitley Bay, and then They were bought out by an Irish meat company, and then we were able to move to Jewetts and Spennymoor. And we've used shots a wee bit in the past, but the abattoirs where they are absolutely at the limit of where we can take our animals. So yes, having an abattoir has made is difference, definitely.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Brilliant, and some really good questions or points being made there. Brennan, I think that's a really interesting point. I'd love to pick up probably after this about that. That's interesting. Is it Fiona Morrison?
Yes, hello. Yes, I'm in Newest as I've been rumbled, I think, by Sarah and so on, and I'm also chair of Scottish Rural Action, and I'm also a crofter. I just kind of wanted to mention that I know that in Greenland, because of the pandemic, that the authorities there enabled, if you like, premises that had been approved as food hygiene safe and so on, where farmers, small farmers and so on, could do essentially what we would call home kill, but in a way that could be sold on to people, knowing that it had been conducted in premises that were approved. And maybe that kind of model could be working in sort of rural communities for all the reasons that we've talked about here, you know, shorter food miles, finishing of meat, added value, all of those reasons. So it's got a name I can't possibly pronounce, but I could find it for you and send it to you if that would be useful. And I just think that we need to make sure that we're considering all this in the context, and politicians in the room, you don't need me to say this, but in the context of the Land Reform Bill, the Agricultural Bill, and the Good Food Nation Bill, on how we look at this, crofting has always sat alongside something else. It's part of the pluralistic economy, and 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded just by 6% of the population who are Indigenous peoples. The Scottish Government is also consulting on Gaeltacht regions, which don't exactly altogether overlap with the crofting counties, but pretty closely. The Scottish Gaels, or the Irish Gaels for that matter, don't have Indigenous status, but what they do have, like many family farmers in rural locations, as opposed to big farms, have that intergenerational mixed model type of land farming, which is often sustainable in a different kind of a way, not so wholly dependent on pesticides, fertilizers, and all these kind of things. So in terms of that food economy, and I know Mary Brennan is in the room here tonight, who's done so much work on that, I just think we should be mindful of that. And the crofters have actually got quite a lot to share on that basis, if I may say so. But I can share the thing from Greenland if that's useful for you.
I think it'd be useful to send it to the Secretariat and then we can push it out. I'm going to be very rude. I'm not necessarily, I saw a question in there, so I'm not sure who to point that out. But if I can make an observation that, you know, when we looked at crofting in the last session of the Parliament, it was clear that crofting reform and the reform of the legislation seemed to be on everyone's agenda. And there was an opportunity to do it, including with a review of small holding legislation to try and make it easier to allow people to develop small holdings, but it seems to have get lost in the big scheme of other things. So I don't know. Are there other questions out there? Are there other hands, Jane, I'm missing? I don't want to be in trouble.
Can't see any hands just now. There was a question that I picked up from the chat from Dimitri. I don't know if Dimitri is still there or would like to ask the question, but it's basically, what is your view on local food provision in the context of a challenging macro environment? So on the one hand, it seems local food can provide a safety net. At the same time, local food businesses are typically smaller, less predictable cash flows, less well capitalized. As incomes are squeezed, will these market participants become stronger, or will many of them fail? I thought that might be actually quite a good question for all three speakers. And I guess, yeah.
Well, as David's had a huge rest, I'm going to put him right on the front line now.
Okay, that's. I think that's my second huge rest of the night, isn't it? So I'm just feeling very relaxed. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it also I mean relates back into what I mentioned earlier about the sustainability in terms of business sustainability of small local producers, where in terms of the actual size of the local market may be quite limited. So I think that idea of trying to ensure that that we're reducing food miles, producing locally. I mean, one thing I'm very aware of is that I suspect you know, our work with Sterling. I mean, we've been looking specifically at remote communities, and in remote communities, just by virtue of the fact that they're island communities, you have much less choice and much less scope. It's if you got to do out shopping, then you got to travel, you know, out with the area, often on a boat or a ferry or several. And I think that may be different in rural communities or communities where access creates different sorts of challenges. But yeah, I think most definitely that they offer where the market is sufficient, where the level of production is sufficient, they offer a good alternative. But in many cases, the sustainability of these businesses is often a challenge. There's some great local producers, some great local produce, but if you're not selling enough stuff off the shelf or direct or via the internet, then your business just is not sustainable in the long term. So I think it's a real challenge, and that's maybe where there needs to be some support and investment to help small local food producers both start up and importantly to continue in business. But at the end of the day, if there isn't a market for the produce or enough people buying it, you know, it is going to be a struggle, whether it's local or not.
Sarah, do you want to come in on that? Because I think that's quite important, and I'm going to sort of link into that. The last point that's just popped up on the chat is how is the cost of living going to crisis that we're facing? How is that going to make specialist, high quality local food producers? How are they going to cope with that as well? Sarah, do you want to go with that? And then I'll come to you, Denise.
Yeah, I think it is really, really difficult. What we found through the pandemic, well, and people that come into the shop, they're not buying lots now. They're making really considered purchases. So they might buy one thing that is of higher value, but then they'll use the refillery, and that'll save them money as well. Certainly as a producer, we used to do eggs, but doing eggs on Bharraigh, somewhere like Bharraigh, is really, really tricky, because if you get too many hens, then you can meet the demand in summer, but then the demand drops off when the visitors go away, and then the cost of feeding has just escalated so much. But you can't charge, you know, you can't keep up with the price, because then people won't buy the eggs at that price. So I think small producers on the island, anywhere that feeding's involved, they're going to really, really be hit hard. Okay,
Sarah, thank you for that. And all I would say to those chicken producers on Bharraigh, thank goodness you don't have pine martins. I lost 6 of my chickens the other night in one sitting. So I might need to come to you for eggs. Denise, do you want to go on that?
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I suppose, and it displays quite a good understanding of where local producers are, that, you know, it is increasingly squeezed, but the advantage of being small and flexible and nimble-footed, if you like, is that, you know, there's not a huge amount of capital, and there's more flexibility to adapt and change. But David was so right, it's actually all about what the market wants. So the macro environment that Dimitri terms it is also wanting food that they trust, that actually has got environmental credibility, addresses issues of climate and biodiversity, and health and animal welfare. So if local food can satisfy that market, and that market is growing. Market research is demonstrating that if you like, the ethical, for want of a better description, drivers for purchasing is growing. I mean, I forget, there's one of the market researchers, 65% of the population of the UK will always look at the label, and if it's got sustainability on it, they'll buy the product, apparently. So the indicators are that this market is growing, and I think I'm optimistic, as long as we can get the infrastructure right, that the local provision of food to grow a local food economy, I think there are definitely prospects, and I'm optimistic.
Okay. Jane, are you spotting other ones? I mean, I think it's interesting that there's some talk about local food producers supplying into big supermarkets. It seems to have worked quite well with Arsène beers and gins, and drinks, but not necessarily so much on food. Or have I got that completely wrong? Denise, do you want to go on that, and David?
Yes. Funny enough, I was as a supplier to Ardross Farm in Fife. Supplies to Ardross, which is a fantastic farm shop, by the way. There was a coffee producer who is actually, as a local provider, has been given space in the local Morrisons. So it looks as if Morrisons are opening up a wee bit to local producers. So there's a possibility there. I mean, I don't know if people are familiar with the French model, but in France, when supermarkets apply for planning permission, they have to dedicate X amount. I can't give you the percentage of the floor space to local producers. I think it's something like 25%. So local supermarkets in France have to provide space for local food.
Okay, I mean, I think that's interesting, and Clarkson, Jeremy type might have views on whether that's a good idea or not with his farm shop. David, Sarah, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether my Sterling colleagues have anything they want to add in terms of national supermarkets and local produce. I think, I mean, again, just on our field work, one of the things we were, I guess, a bit surprised at was, I think we would have expected in some of the stores, particularly national retailers, to see a bit more local produce. But again, and again, Eric Calderwood is the expert on the co-op, but I think much of the supply is driven by decisions made more centrally in terms of what produce is available, what's on the shelf, etc. Eric can probably qualify that. But we would have expected to see, I think, a little bit more local produce. There is, I mean, again, there's a lot of local produce. I think, Sarah, in Bùth, I mean, in Bharraigh, I mean, there's a great range of produce in your store. But again, I think a lot of that produce, some of it is addressing the basic foodstuffs and the basic needs in terms of the dried goods. But I think it is this thing about local is what are you providing? Are you providing the basic and the staples, the vegetables, the potatoes? Or are you providing the jams and the chutneys? So the idea of local encompasses a wide range of products, some of which are central to and necessary for a basic diet. Others are more complementary. So I think there are lots of opportunities for local, but it's often manifest in many ways. Some might appeal to the tourist. Some might be an important part of ensuring that local islanders can eat well and eat healthily and affordably as well. So,
Sarah, do you want to bat around that?
Yeah, we did actually look, before we set the Bùth up, we did look at the option of getting local produce into our co-op, but it was just so many barriers that were put. They weren't interested in seasonal. They wanted quite a high supply rate that it's not possible for, we even considered doing it like cooperatively with a few crofters. but it wasn't possible. They really weren't interested, and that might have changed now, but we did look at that.
I wish we could get this right. I mean, I despair when I see carrots going from the farm at home all the way down to Middle England to be washed, cleaned, and brought back up in bags to put into local shops. It can't be the way forward. AF, who is AF? Making comments there about Waitrose and Morrison's. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? I'm intrigued about that. Who's that? Who's AF? Anyone going to own up?
Hello, that's myself.
Adam.
Hi there.
Tell me a bit about what you put in there. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's just a wee bit from my experience on the supplier side, working for Stoats Porridge. But currently, my role at Scotland Food and Drink, I'm aware that we have graduates we've got a graduate in breaks, and we've got a graduate placement at Morrison's as well. It's these graduates that sort of facilitate a bit more local sourcing. So with a bit of investment in that, we can make it easier for the supermarkets to take on these local listings.
And do they require any specialist packaging and stuff to be used if they're going into supermarkets? That's a question from AY, who you prompted into.
Usually the sort of minimum standard is SALSA accreditation for the processing facilities. So you would need SALSA accreditation and obviously just meeting legal standards for your packaging that would apply in most resale environments.
Okay, Adam, that's really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to take one more question, then I'm going to ask a question myself, unless other hands dive up. I've got Paul. Paul, you had your hand up. Where were you?
Yeah. Hi, Edward. Yeah, I'm one of the authors with David from the University of Stirling. And I suppose listening to a lot of the comments, I sort of get the impression that people consider it very difficult to try to work with some of the large supermarkets. And I just wondered if it would be an idea to invite people from one of the large multiples to this meeting, because the thing I do know is they have, for example, local buying managers and local sourcing managers whose job it is to source locally and work with local suppliers. So in relation to the question that was raised about, packaging, etc., one of the things that they do offer is support and advice on branding, and packaging, transportation, etc. And it might be useful to have somebody from one of the multiples to come and explain what it is they do and how they try to support local businesses. You've only got to drive past one of the Aldis or the Lidls, and it's emblazoned with "we source Scottish products," etc. Now that's not necessarily just large producers, but also small producers as well. Okay, that was just my reflection, just to add to what Dave has been saying. That's all.
And I've just got my wrist slap saying that not all Scottish carrots go to the Midlands. Well, no, they don't, but mine did, and I'm embarrassed by it. Anyway, so let's not dwell on that. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask? Lots of comments coming up. I think the point about supermarkets and how they interact with farmers is an interesting one. I was at Morrison's abattoir in Turriff the other day, and I was actually intrigued with how they interact with local farmers and how they deal with that and how they get and how much processing was on site. I had no idea. So it might be something that we could consider doing. I'm looking for any other questions. Jane, have I missed anyone?
I don't think so. Paul's still got his hand up. I don't know if he wants to come back or if that's a legacy hand.
Sorry, legacy hand, sorry.
Okay. Oh, Fiona.
I was just going to say that I know it's really difficult, the viability of abattoirs, but they did have, for a while there, a really interesting setup in Stornoway, as it happens, because they didn't have enough throughput to sustain an abattoir 12 months of the year. As you probably know, Collian and Eilean-Shire, the local council, are involved in the running of that abattoir. But in terms of apprenticeships for passing on skills, they were looking at doing a shared apprenticeship with local butcher shops. There's a few award-winning butcher shops in Stornoway, as you might know, Charlie Barley's and MacLeod's and all that kind of thing. So, but it was quite good that they could have 6 months, the young person could have 6 months in the butcher shops learning those skills and 6 months at the abattoir. So it was just a more flexible approach, if you like, to the skills agenda and providing that service within a community where perhaps the throughput would not be as high as it might be somewhere else. So I just thought I'd add that.
Okay. Stephen, you've made a comment there. Yeah, you're right. Tariff are deboning sheep meat from down south, but they're also killing a lot of sheep in Tariff and processing them. 140 cows and God, not quite sure how many beef animals are going through there, but there's a lot going through there. There's a lot going on, and actually, I thought it was quite interesting in the sense that at slack times in the market, they were bringing meat up to process it to keep the factory fully turned over, which seems an interesting way of doing it. Yeah, it was. I have to say, it was impressive as a beef farmer to see stuff going through there so quickly. So, and MacLean Bakery, yes, is that the one in Nairn? I don't know who that is. Sorry, in Forres it is, isn't it? There's a MacLean's Bakery.
That's
No?
newest, sorry. Just what the co-op likes is they like a range of products, but it's very difficult for a crofter if you supply eggs or if you supply potatoes. They don't really want to hear from you from individual products. They're happy to take a producer that can supply a range of products for them all year round.
Okay, I fear this conversation could go on all evening, so I'm going to pose one question finally, if I may, to each of the panelists, and I'll see how many people log off before I get to the end of it, whether this was the right thing to do or not. But my question is, do you believe that if we taught seasonality of food to our children and people to use in the kitchen, we would get more people buying locally? So I'm gonna, Sarah, you're nodding, so I love it when people agree with me. I'll come to you first.
Definitely. There's a massive skills gap in cooking skills. I mean, our secondary school in Castleby doesn't teach home economics, which is terrible. There's a lack of skills in the school canteen. There's a massive skills gap that needs to be filled so that people can know what to do with seasonal products and cook from scratch.
Denise.
Thanks, Edward. I don't think seasonality is the issue. I just think it's learning how to cook and learning how to handle meat. We had Earlston High School around the farm, the butchery, last week, 16 to 17-year-olds. And they've really found it very difficult to handle meat. And none of them were vegetarian, they were all meat eaters, but they couldn't handle the carcasses. So it's a very serious issue, actually, teaching children about and young people about how to cook and how to handle food, because that is key to localizing food and buying locally as well.
Okay. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with both Sarah and Denise. I mean, one thing I thought was very interesting that Denise said was she talked about having a very wide range and variety of customers, and she talked about that at some length. And I think knowing what to look for and what to buy is part of that skill base. I think the reality is, at least in the short term, lots of people are watching their pennies, and in trying to price compete, we often don't compare like with like. And I think there's an old saying, you get what you pay for, and I think much of that is true in terms of food. So given the cost of food, we should hopefully know how to cook it, and I think it is a real challenge. There are lots of alternatives these days. I think it's often about choice and alternatives, and some of us make choices one way, others make them the other way, and often with good valid reasons for whether you're going down the home cooked route or an easier route. So yeah, I think cooking skills are part of that. But in the short term, I think it's challenging because we've just seen a huge increase in the price of food, and I think that's for many people that's a big issue and a big disincentive and a barrier to at least eating better and eating well.
Okay, brilliant.
Sorry to end on a down note. Yeah.
No, you'd not ended on a down note because you almost agreed with me. So you've almost ended on a perfect note. So can I just say to our three speakers this evening, David, Denise and Sarah, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. The snake, as I call it, on the side of my page has been filled with comments. And the fact that it's filled with comments means that people are enjoying it and interacting. And that's purely because of you three for all the effort you put into this evening. So we can't do an online clap, but if I do my hands like that, I'll do it for everyone. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed that. Can I just say that the next meetings, I think we've got the 6th of December, which I can absolutely tell you at this stage will be my co-convener Emma will be chairing that one because I know I'm not here there. The 7th of March and the 6th of June, and we are really hopeful on the other two that we are going to get the Cabinet Secretary Marie Goujon to come and speak to us. She was unfortunately unavailable so far, but when I next find her in the Parliament, I'm going to make sure that she puts one of them in her diaries, and I will do it in such a way that she doesn't feel that she can refuse. So I'd like to also just thank the Secretariat for all the work they do. I mean, you know, I wouldn't be able to sit here making it look easy if that's what I do, or making it look difficult because I'm not good at it, but they make it possible by getting everyone in the right direction, making all the organisation. And thanks very much. And I look forward, well, I don't look forward to seeing you. I might be able to do the 6th remotely, but we'll see. And thank you very much, everyone. What a great evening. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And now I'm going to go and eat, Sarah, because of all the pictures and Denise that you showed me. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone.